Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, what is borderline stalking? So I've seen this question a few times in kind of related questions. Another related question here would be, what is fatal attraction syndrome? Which of course isn't a real syndrome, it's just a term people use sometimes to really refer to the stalking behavior that we sometimes see with borderline personality disorder. The reason we see the term fatal attraction in there is because of a 1987 movie by the same name with Michael Douglas and Glenn Close. So this movie portrayed behavior that could be attributed to borderline personality disorder, and we've seen other movies that kind of followed the same pattern. So really what this question is getting at is, what is the relationship between borderline personality disorder and stalking? And I think when we think of borderline personality disorder, people think of the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment and kind of connect that to stalking. So first I'll start with the definition of stalking. With stalking we see an offender who exhibits chronic nuisance behaviors that result in deleterious emotional or physical effects on a victim. And it's believed to come from an illogical or irrational fascination or preoccupation with an individual, and sometimes it can rise to the level of psychosis. So there can be reality testing problems involved with stalking. Now, sometimes in the research literature we see another term used instead of stalking called unwanted pursuit behavior. And this is similar, there's a lot of overlap with stalking, but usually unwanted pursuit behavior is thought of as more widespread and less severe as compared to stalking. Also, stalking does not necessarily result from an intimacy motive, and it's always illegal. Unwanted pursuit behavior doesn't necessarily cause fear or threaten the victim, and it's not always illegal. One way we could think about unwanted pursuit behavior and its relationship to stalking could be unwanted pursuit behavior, again, like I said, isn't necessarily illegal, but if it occurs for too long a period of time, it could rise to the level of stalking. So one tactic, as they're called, with unwanted pursuit behavior may not be illegal, may not even be abnormal, but if it continues for a while, then we might have stalking. So we see in the media that the stereotype of a stalker involves a stranger who stalks a celebrity. But what we see in reality is relational stalking, not stranger stalking, is the most prototypical form of stalking behavior. 80% of all stalking cases involve victims and perpetrators who had some type of prior relationship, and in half of all stalking scenarios, we see the individuals had a prior romantic relationship. Now, some of the descriptive statistics around stalking are really ranges rather than precise numbers, because we see a lot of different studies on this topic and a lot of variation in terms of the results. For example, around 8 to 25% of women will be a victim of stalking at some point in their lives, and about 2 to 11% of men will be victims at some point in their lives. Now, with unwanted pursuit behavior, we see that 37% of ex-partners exhibit at least one of these tactics after a failed relationship. So unwanted pursuit behavior is remarkably common compared to stalking. Also, we see a number of benign tactics associated with unwanted pursuit behavior, like watching or monitoring or making exaggerated expressions of affection. With stalking, we see behaviors that are often considered more serious, as I indicated before. And if we look at the behaviors in terms of which ones are most common to which ones are least common, with stalking, we see unwanted telephone calls and messages are the most common, and then moving down the list, we see unwanted letters, someone who spreads rumors about an ex-partner, we see someone who is being followed or spied on, we see a victim being unexpectedly confronted by a perpetrator or being waited for, and then the least common would be to receive unwanted presents. So what does all this have to do with borderline personality disorder? I cover a lot of the aspects of stalking and unwanted pursuit behavior. Well, if we look at borderline personality disorder, we know it is a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, specifically a cluster B personality disorder. So it's a personality disorder in the same group as antisocial, narcissistic, and histrionic personality disorders. With borderline personality disorder, we see 9 symptom criteria. Somebody would have to have 5 criteria in order to be diagnosed with a disorder. So we see frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, an unstable relationship pattern, identity disturbance, so difficulty with self-image, impulsivity in at least two areas that would be self-damaging, suicidal behavior, affective instability, which is emotional dysregulation, when somebody has difficulty kind of keeping their emotions in check. We see chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate or intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, and we also see paranoid ideation or severe dissociation. So as you can see, some of those symptom criteria seem to line up with the behaviors of stalking and unwanted pursuit behavior fairly well. The frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, the anger, the impulsivity, the emotional dysregulation, the unstable relationship pattern, and maybe even in some instances the paranoid ideation and the chronic feelings of emptiness, because chronic feelings of emptiness might be related to rumination, and that's tied to stalking behavior. So one way to examine the relationship between borderline personality disorder and stalking would be to look at a group of people who have admitted to stalking or who have been convicted of stalking and seeing how many of those have borderline personality disorder. The difficulty with this is we don't have a lot of research in this area, although we do see some studies that cover this. And really this can be broken down into two different groups. So with one of these groups, we see that for people who demonstrate stalking behavior that have not been charged with a crime. So these are people who admit to it, but again, there's no criminal justice involvement. We see that borderline personality disorder may be present up to 45% of the time. So in 45% of those people, they may have the disorder. Now, for people in the criminal justice system, the prevalence drops to somewhere between 4 and 15%. So fewer people in the criminal justice system for stalking would have borderline personality disorder. Now, this seems kind of unusual. There's no real quick or easy explanation for this. But one theory is that perhaps in those settings, in criminal settings, there are other explanations for a number of those stalking behaviors, including other mental disorders like schizophrenia. So we don't really know, so this gives us a range all the way from 4%, as I mentioned, up to 45%. Now, to make this a little bit more confusing, as we move away from examining criminal and non-criminal, we see other studies that show that with stalking behavior, about 50% of the individuals who demonstrate that behavior would have a cluster B personality disorder. Now, that may be borderline personality disorder, but it may not be, because again, there are 3 other personality disorders in cluster B. But we do know from this research that even in instances where there was another personality disorder other than borderline personality disorder present, the borderline personality traits are often at a high level. So what this means is that everything is really on a continuum. So there are 9 symptom criteria for borderline personality disorder, but somebody could meet a few of those criteria and not have the disorder, but they may still have borderline personality traits or characteristics. So this kind of gives us a measure on a continuum as opposed to categorical, and it can give us more insight into stalking behavior and what may be connected to it. So borderline personality as a construct does seem to have a fairly strong relationship to stalking. Now, some people really struggle with the idea that individuals with borderline personality disorder might be more likely to engage in stalking behavior. And I think one of these reasons is because a lot of people think of stalkers as being primarily men. Now, we do know in about 75% of the cases of stalking, the scenario breaks down where the man is the perpetrator and there's a woman who's a victim. So this explains, again, the majority of cases, but that leaves a lot of other room for other types of scenarios, including scenarios where the female could be the stalker. Now, when we look to specifically unwanted pursuit behavior, which again is related but it's not the same thing as stalking, we see that research indicates that men and women perpetrate an equal number of tactics over a similar time span. Now, the methods are a little bit different. So men stalk in a different way as opposed to women. We see men are more likely to leave unwanted gifts and messages of affection, and women are more likely to be physically violent toward their ex-partner. So the number of tactics are the same, but again, the expression is a little different. The type of tactics are a little bit different. Another way to look at the relationship between borderline and stalking would be to look at the risk factors and see if any of them seem to be tied to borderline personality disorder. Well, there are a number of risk factors for stalking and for unwanted pursuit behavior. including the initiation of a breakup by the perpetrator's ex-partner. We see more anxious attachment in the former relationship. So when a relationship seems to be kind of at the beginning of stalking, when it came from a failed relationship, we see that anxious attachment. And that's interesting if we think about borderline personality disorder, because it does have an association with anxious attachment. We believe what happens here is the rejection elicits more obsessive thoughts about the ex-partner. And again, that's fairly consistent with borderline personality disorder with a few of the aspects, but that would include, as I mentioned before, the chronic feeling of emptiness. We also see that ex-intimate stalkers often have a history of criminal convictions and mental health problems, including higher levels of borderline personality traits, as I mentioned before. Some factors, though, when we talk about different personality factors and things like that, some of these factors have no explanatory value at all, meaning they don't appear to have any relationship with stalking. For example, avoidant attachment has no association with stalking. Empathy in the past relationship has no association, so a lot of people would think that low empathy would result in more stalking, but it doesn't. And we also see that psychopathic and narcissistic traits have no association to stalking, which I think is fairly surprising when we think about all the characteristics of psychopathy and narcissism. So what are the typical characteristics of a female stalker? So when there is a female stalker, whether she has borderline personality disorder or borderline personality traits or something else or nothing else, what characteristics might we expect to see? What would be typical? Well, we see a study here of 82 women who were involved in stalking, and we get kind of a profile from this study. It's pretty interesting. I'll put all the references for the studies I used in the description for the video. So here we see the typical characteristics would be Caucasian, heterosexual, having an age range between 18 and 58 with an average of 35, not having children, and being well educated. With this particular group of 82 women I'm talking about half had borderline personality disorder, and a third used substances while stalking. So there may be some comorbidity there with substance use disorder. The women in the study gave several reasons as to why they engaged in stalking behavior, which I think gives us some insight into what's going on in terms of mental health and personality characteristics. And the reasons were anger, obsessions, feelings of abandonment, dependency, and loneliness. So several of those, of course, could be tied to borderline personality features. The usual stalking behaviors manifested by this particular group, again, female stalkers in this study, included telephone calls, messages, giving letters and gifts, driving by the victim's home or work, trespassing, following a victim. And we also see that more than half of the women threatened their victims, a quarter were physically violent with their victims, and 3 of the stalkers committed murder. They killed their victims. So when we talk about stalking, whether we're talking about a male or female perpetrator, we're really talking about something quite serious. I know whenever I talk about borderline personality disorder or cluster B personality disorders and stalking and these related constructs, there are going to be a variety of opinions, people who agree or disagree with me. Please put your thoughts in the comments section. As always, I hope you found this description of borderline personality disorder and stalking to be interesting. Thanks for watching.